The morning in Rome did not begin with the crowing of the roosters, but with a multi-sensory attack. For Livia, the first sign of the day was the smell, a complex and nauseating mixture that seeped through the cracks of her cella. There was the smell of bread baking in some nearby bakery, an almost sweet note, quickly subdued by the ubiquitous stench of sewage from the alleys, the metallic smell of blood coming from a butcher's shop, and, most personal of all, the sour aroma of cheap wine, the sweat of strangers, and the despair of yesterday that seemed to have solidified in the stone walls of his cubicle. The cold air of dawn brought with it the cacophony of Sabura waking up. The rolling of the iron wheels of the supply carts was like a constant thunderclap, punctuated by the shouts of the vendors who advertised their products. Fresh olives from Baiae! Fish from the Tiber! It is still struggling! Somewhere above, in one of the insulae, apartment buildings that rose like rotten teeth toward the sky, a baby cried incessantly. 6 months ago, these sounds would have been the harbinger of a hunt or a celebration. She was Brenna, the daughter of a tribal chief of the Cherokee, and the morning air smelt of pine, damp earth, and campfire smoke. Now it was Livia, a name that sounded strange in her own mind, owned by Marcia, a magnifying glass, a she-wolf in the smiling wolf's lupanar. The transition had been a blur of fire, screams in a language she didn't understand, the humiliation of being exposed and valued like cattle, and the nauseating rocking of a ship where fear was so thick it could be tasted. His day did not belong to him. It began with the metallic sound and ended with Marcia's key turning on the iron lock of her door. Marcia did not speak. She simply opened the doors and her gaze was order. The first task was to clean, emptying the ceramic jars filled with the night's waste, a task that made her stomach turn. Then, scrubbing the stone floor, trying in vain to remove stains that were already part of the rock itself. Water was a luxury that had to be fetched from a public fountain 2 streets away. Carrying the heavy buckets back, feeling the weight on her already aching shoulders, was one of the few moments when she saw the open sky. In those brief moments, she looked at the birds and felt a pang of pain so deep that it was almost physical. Breakfast was a cruel formality, a throat-scratching piece of dark, hard bread dipped in a bowl of pasca, the drink of vinegar and water that fed the legionaries and slaves. Eaten standing on the patio under the gaze of Marcia, who seemed to resent every crumb they consumed. The rest of the morning was a long, empty wait. Women sat on wooden benches, a mosaic of origins and tragedies. Gaulish, Hispanic, Greek, and even Roman women fallen from grace. They would delicate lice on each other, an activity that created grotesque intimacy, or patch up the coarse robes they were forced to wear during the day. Livia tried to keep her distance, an act that the others interpreted as arrogance. "Look at the barbarian little princess. Do you think it's too good for us?" Before Livia could react, Helena, the Greek with tired eyes, intervened without raising her voice. "Leave her, Gaia. Her pride is all she has. It won't last long." Helena then sat down next to Livia, the smell of dried herbs emanating from her. "She's not wrong, you know," the Greek murmured. "Pride is a poison here, but so is fear. You need to find the balance. Be like a reed, not like an oak tree. Bend in the wind, or you'll break." Helena was teaching Livia the unspoken rules, not out of kindness, but out of a pragmatism that bordered on ecology. In its brutal ecosystem, the group's survival, even if fragile, depended on a precarious balance. Rule number 1, Helena said on another occasion. What they do to your body is not who you are. Build a wall in your mind. Let them have the body, but never, ever let them cross the wall. The afternoon brought Marcia's inspection. Marcia was a woman whose past was engraved on her face. Under the heavy makeup, there were scars. Her hardness was that of something that was forged, not born. She lined up the women in the courtyard and examined them as a general inspects his troops before battle. Her fingers, surprisingly strong, probed, squeezed, looked for any sign of disease, any bruise that would damage the property. Once, she found a scratch on the thigh of a young Syrian girl. Marcia did not ask how it happened. She took a short whip and gave the girl 3 quick blows on the back, one for carelessness, one for reducing profit, and one so you remember. As the shadows lengthened, the atmosphere changed. The lethargy of waiting gave way to an electric voltage. The second meal of the day was served, a thin stew, almost always with the same overcooked vegetables and a few grains. Then the ritual of transformation began. Soot mixed with fat for the eyes, chalk powder for a ghostly white on the skin, red ochre for the cheeks and lips, roughly applied, a mask of grotesque seduction, and finally the toga, the garment of shame. For a man, it was a symbol of citizenship, for them, of public availability. When the first oil lamps were lit, their dancing flames casting monstrous shadows on the walls, the smiling wolf Lupanar officially opened its doors. The day was the anteroom to hell, a long and gray ordeal. The night was hell itself, in vibrant and terrible colors. The rise in the invisible hierarchy of Roman prostitution was not an escalation, but a dangerous dance on a floor covered with broken glass. Each misstep could result in a deep wound. For Livia, the rise began with the discovery that her greatest weakness could be her greatest strength. His haughtiness, the refusal of his spirit to break completely, was seen by customers not as insubordination, but as an exotic challenge. It was different from the tired submission of the others. Helena, seeing this, gave him a crucial lesson. "They don't want you," said the Greek, as they watched a fat merchant negotiate with Marcia. "They want the story they tell themselves about you. The merchant wants the innocent farm girl whom he corrupts. The soldier wants the enemy warrior he subdues. The politician wants the secret that no one else can have. Find out what story they want and sell it. It's easier than selling yourself." Livia hated the idea. It was a betrayal of herself, of Brenna. But hunger was a persuasive advisor. She began to experiment. With a drunken legionnaire bragging about his conquests on the frontier, she remained silent, rigid, with fire in her eyes. He loved it. He called her a little Valkyrie and paid Marcia twice as much, feeling that he had tamed something wild. With an older, soft-spoken cloth merchant, she lowered her bays, feigned shyness, and spoke in a soft voice about missing the mountains. He held her hand, gave her an extra coin, and walked away feeling like a protector. They were performances, and each one of them emptied her a little more, but also taught her. She was learning to wear men's costumes as armor. The milestone of his ascension was Gaius Valerius Flaccus. His first appearance was typical: a group of praetorians, young, arrogant, and noisy, celebrating a payment. While his friends grabbed the women and laughed loudly, Keo stayed behind. His eyes had no usual lust, but an almost hesitant curiosity. Marcia pushed him towards Livia. In the cella, the smell of strong wine emanated from him, but his behavior was different. He sat on the edge of the stone bed, the space barely allowing them to be there without touching. He didn't move. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. "Livia," she replied, her voice hoarse. "That doesn't sound like a name from Germania," he said. "My name was Brenna." The confession escaped before she could stop it. He was silent for a long time, then just said, "I'm sorry." He left the full payment on the small stone shelf and left. Livia's surprise was immense. He returned a week later, sober. He brought him a pear, hidden in the fold of his tunic. The freshness and sweetness of the fruit in her mouth was a revelation, a taste of a forgotten world. They talked. He talked about his childhood on a farm in Umbria, describing the smell of the earth after the rain and the sound of cicadas on summer afternoons. She hesitantly talked about the forests of her home, about hunting with her father. Her Latin was broken, but he listened to her with infinite patience, gently correcting a word here and there. Keo became his regular customer once a week. This regularity elevated him in the status of lupanar. Marcia, always with an eye on profit, began to reserve it for the nights when Keo came, which spared her from the worst customers. The envy of the other women was palpable. "The Praetorian's favorite thinks she's an empress," Gaius sneered, but there was a note of fear in her voice. The patronage of a Praetorian was a powerful protection. The rise was also intellectual. With Keo, she learned more than just words. He began to scratch letters in the dust on the floor with a stick. A, B, C. To her, they were magical symbols that could capture speech. She practiced in secret, her hungry mind devouring knowledge. He also brought him extra coins, 1 or 2 sesterces, which he pressed into her hand when no one was looking. "For you," he whispered, "not for her." On Helena's advice, she found a loose stone under her stone bed. There, in the cold of the earth, she began to build her peculium, her secret treasure. Each coin was a step on a journey of 1,000 miles. She was rising, moving from obscurity to dangerous notoriety. Her rise was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the relative protection and knowledge that Gaius provided her. On the other, the visibility that put her on the radar of much more powerful and much less kind men. She was learning to play the game of Rome, not realizing that she was about to be promoted to a much larger and deadlier board.
The routine, once a monotonous anchor, was now punctuated by expectant anxiety. Livia's days were divided into 2 realities, the grey and oppressive life of the lupanar and the brief windows of color and hope that Gaius' visits provided. He was her teacher, her confidant, and the only person in Rome who called her Brenna in whispers. But fame, even infamy, is a hungry creature in the eternal city. The story of a Germanic prostitute, beautiful and haughty, who had captivated a Praetorian, began to snake through the alleys of Subura, reaching the ears of men for whom a novelty was the only spice left for their dull appetites. Marcia, with her predator instincts for profit, felt the change in the current. Wealthier clients, men who would not normally venture into the depths of the Subura, began to appear, discreetly asking for the Praetorian Germanic. For Lena, Livia was transforming from a cash cow into a race horse. It was time to introduce her in a new arena. The night of the presentation was preceded by a ritual that separated her from the other women. Marcia called her into her office, a cramped room that smelled of old papyrus and money. Lena wasted no time. "You've been getting attention, girl, attention that is worth gold." His small, calculating eyes scanned Livia as if she were evaluating a horse. "Tonight, you won't work in the cells, the top room. A senator will be here, Decimus Junius Silanus." The name fell in the room like a stone. Silanus was a figure of immense power and terrible reputation, known for his cruelty and his depraved tastes. A cold, cutting fear, very different from the numbing dread of her first nights, gripped Livia. It was the fear of those who understand the threat. "He heard about you," Marcia continued, ignoring Livia's pallor. "He is particular. He doesn't want an ordinary prostitute. He wants a work of art. Your job tonight is not to please you in body but in mind. You will be beautiful, silent, and obedient. Do you understand?" The threat in his voice was clear. A mistake with a man like Silanus would not result in a flogging, would result in a disappearance. The preparation was meticulous and humbling. Instead of the coarse makeup, Marcia brought a bottle of scented jasmine oil. A slave girl combed Livia's hair, tying it up in a simple Greek style that accentuated her neck. The usual toga was replaced by a tunic of fine linen, almost transparent, of a deep blue like the night sky. "He wants to see what he is buying," said Marcia with a smile devoid of humor. The upper room was another world. While the downstairs was stone, darkness, and despair, the upstairs was a cocoon of decadent luxury. The floor was covered by a stunning mosaic of Dionysus in his chariot. Divans with purple silk cushions were arranged around a low bronze table. The air was heavy with the smell of expensive incense and wine from Falerno. Reclining on one of the couches, like an indolent and bloated god, was Senator Silanus. He was older than Livia had imagined, with a limp face marked by excesses and small bored eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Next to him, another man, younger and nervous, laughed subserviently at something the senator had said. When Livia entered, silence fell. Silanus looked at her with the same expression he would use to inspect a new horse or a Greek vase. He didn't invite her to sit down. He only gestured with his hand so that she was in the center of the room, under the light of a bronze chandelier. She stood there, feeling his gaze dissect her, cataloging every curve, every line, every breath. It was a demonstration of pure and absolute power. She was not a guest, she was the main attraction. The night dragged on in a silent torture. She poured wine, her hand trembling slightly as she filled the silver cups. She listened to their conversation, an outpouring of politics, gossip, and contempt. They talked about the ill health of Emperor Tiberius, about the ambitions of Sejanus, the captain of the Praetorian Guard, and about the fortunes that would be made and lost in aqueduct contracts. They spoke as if she were not there, as if she were deaf, mute, and stupid. And it was at that moment that Elena's strategy became her lifeline. She built the wall in her mind. Behind that wall, she was not a statue, she was a spy. She listened, absorbed, filed away every name, every alliance, every enmity. Finally, Silanus dismissed his guest. The silence that followed was heavier than the conversation. He stood up and walked slowly around her, like a wolf circling her prey. He didn't touch her, except for a moment, when he reached out and grabbed a strand of her blonde hair, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger, testing its texture. "Interesting," he muttered, more to himself than to her. That night she was not physically raped in the usual way, but the breach went deeper. He had stripped her of her humanity, turning her into an object of curiosity. When he finally dismissed her with a wave of his hand and she walked down the stairs back into the darkness of her cella, the smell of jasmine on her skin felt like a stain she could never wash away. She had understood the terrible truth. Her small ascent was not leading her to freedom, but to a golden cage guarded by a monster far more powerful than Marcia could ever be.
The terror Solanas instilled in Livia was unlike anything she had ever felt. It was not the sharp, hot fear of battle, nor the cold, numbing dread of slavery. It was a cerebral fear, the realization that I was entangled in a game whose rules were unknown and whose penalty was annihilation. This fear, however, did not paralyze her. On the contrary, he focused his mind with the precision of a lens burning under the sun. Passive survival, Helena's reed tactic, was no longer an option. A reed in a garden might survive a storm, but a reed in a senator's path would simply be trampled underfoot. She needed a new strategy, one that was proactive, audacious, and entirely her own. Their daily life became a clandestine training camp. Every task, no matter how humiliating, has been re-evaluated for strategic value. Morning cell cleaning was no longer just dirty work, it was information gathering. She would examine the graffiti left behind by clients, not just deciphering the words, but analyzing the handwriting, the names, the affiliations. Gaius Fulvius of the 9th Legion is a thief, scrawled on a wall, was more than an insult. It was a data. A heart with the initials L and S was a clue about a man's life outside those walls. Waiting in the courtyard became his mental gym. While the other women gossiped or slept, Livia practiced. She replayed in her mind the conversations she had overheard, the names of the senators, the prices of the goods the merchants discussed. It forced his memory to become a fortress, each stone in the wall. Helena watched her with a mixture of admiration and dread. "You're playing with the fire of the gods, little mouse," the Greek warned, and she showed him how to sew a small pocket hidden inside her tunic. Knowledge is power, yes, but in Rome, the knowledge that the powerful don't want you to have is a death sentence. Helena, however, became his most crucial ally. The Greek, who had survived for decades in that world, possessed a different kind of knowledge. She taught Livia to read the unsaid, the strain on a customer's shoulder that indicated he was lying, the way Marcia's eyes narrowed slightly when a business was particularly lucrative. She shared a story one night, in whispers, about a girl named Lila who had heard a secret about a magistrate and tried to sell it. They found her in the Tiber a week later. Helena concluded, "Information is nothing without the strategy to use it and time. You need to know when to use what you know." The peculium became the center of her strategy. It was the physical manifestation of her hope. Every coin she hid under the loose stone was an act of rebellion. She didn't just tell them, she studied them. The face of Tiberius on a sestertius, the symbol of a legion on a denarius. She began to understand the economy that enslaved her. She overheard a customer brag about buying a cook slave for 20,000 sestertians. The number was so vast that it almost made her laugh. Her small pile of coins looked like an insult in front of such a mountain, but it wasn't the size that mattered. That was what it represented. It was hers. Solanas' visits became the core of her intelligence gathering. She used it as a diary, a silent receptacle for his arrogance and paranoia. He bragged about how he had humiliated a rival in the Senate, how he had manipulated a vote, how he planned to acquire a villa that belonged to a senator in financial difficulty. In his presence, Livia perfected the art of invisibility. She became the ignorant barbarian with a vacant stare and a submissive posture, encouraging him to talk more, to reveal more. He didn't see the sharp mind behind her eyes, recording every word, connecting every dot. Caio, in his visits, felt the change. She was more focused, more intense. "You look different," one night, his voice filled with concern. "Your eyes, they're always calculating." She wanted to tell him to share the burden, but she knew she couldn't. To involve him would be to put him in mortal danger. "I'm just learning to survive in Rome, Caio," she replied, the half-truth ringing hollow. Their strategy was multifaceted, a relentless accumulation of information from Solani and other customers, the slow but steady growth of her capital, and the improvement of her observation and deception skills under Helena's tutelage. She was weaving a net, thread by thread, in the dark. She still didn't know what kind of prey she intended to capture. She only knew that when the time came, she would not be the one to struggle in the web.
In a war of attrition, victories are rarely pitched battles. Outposts are taken, supply lines are cut, the enemy's morale is eroded little by little. Livia's first achievements were just like that, small but immensely significant, changing the topography of her captivity and strengthening her resolve. The first achievement was about ignorance. His mind, now diligently trained, began to see patterns. She noticed that certain customers, before large business transactions, were more nervous and talked more. She realized that Marcia's cruelty increased when profits decreased. She turned the lupanar into her laboratory of human behavior. The most tangible victory came with language. One night, a wool merchant, known for his pettiness, tried to deceive her. He paid Marcia for an hour, but tried to leave after 20 minutes, hoping for a partial refund from Lena. Before Marcia could scream, Livia spoke, her voice calm and clear. The deal was for a full clepsydra. The sand is not yet halfway through. She pointed to the small hourglass of water that Marcia used for the wealthiest customers. The merchant gaped, shocked both by her audacity and by the fact that she knew the term clepsydra. Marcia, taken by surprise, gave Livia a long, indecipherable look before shooing the merchant back to his cell to get the full value of his money. It was a small change, but the dynamics had changed. Livia was no longer just a body. He was a witness. The second conquest was a silent revenge, an act of justice in a place that knew none. There was a construction foreman named Sextus, a burly man with hands like pig fangs, who took pleasure in inflicting pain. Their specialty was leaving bruises in places that tunics could not easily hide, knowing that women would be punished for their damaged property. One night, he was particularly brutal with a new girl from Syria, leaving her sobbing in silence. Livia, who had heard Sextus brag to another customer about how he diverted bronze from Agrippa's new baths to sell on the black market, saw her opportunity.
That morning, when the whole Lupanar was plunged into exhausted silence, she picked up a piece of coal from the kitchen. With her heart pounding against her ribs, she snuck up to the outer wall near the entrance. In trembling and deliberately childish letters, she wrote, "Sextus sells Agrippa's bronze near the Fabricius Bridge." The risk was monumental. If caught, the punishment would be exemplary and probably final. She returned to her cell, her body shaking, and did not sleep. The next morning, as he left, Sextus saw the inscription. The blood disappeared from his face. He looked frantically around, his eyes meeting Livia's for a second. In them, he saw no fear, but a cold emptiness. He knew that anyone, a rival, an informant of the 80s, could see that. He turned and practically ran down the street, disappearing. He never returned. A respectful silence settled among the women in relation to Livia. No one talked about it, but everyone knew. The predator had been hunted. The third achievement was the manipulation of his captor. Silanus, in his arrogance, continued to treat her as his exotic pet. "My little wild girl is learning the customs of the city," he once remarked to a guest, with a condescending laugh. He decided for his own amusement to educate her. He began to read to her excerpts from Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the manual of seduction and intrigue. "Look, child," he explained a verse about cheating on a husband. "Poetry teaches us that the world is a stage, and we are all actors." He had no idea that his student was absorbing each lesson, not as poetry, but as a tactics manual. He was unknowingly sharpening the knife that could one day be used against him. These victories, though small, were the fuel for her soul. Her peculium grew slowly, now reaching almost 300 sesterces. It was a derisory sum for a man like Silanus, but for Livia it was a war treasure. Each coin was a testament to a small victory, a humiliation endured, a secret kept. She was building her arsenal piece by piece in the heart of the empire. Her achievements were strengthening her, but also highlighting her, like a nail that rises and begs to be hammered. And the biggest battle of all was yet to come.
The great battle of Livia's life did not begin with a declaration of war, but with a treacherous whisper in her bloodstream. It all started with a lingering chill, a chill that came not from the damp stone floor, but from within his own bones. Then came the pain, a deep pain in his joints that made every movement agony. And then the heat, a ferocious fever that took her, turning her body into a battlefield, her skin into a scorching desert, and her mind into a whirlwind of nightmares. In the closed and unhygienic environment of the Lupanar, the disease was the most feared enemy. It was contagious, ugly, and most of all, bad for business. Helena was the first to notice. His experienced eyes saw past the blush that fever gave to Livia's cheeks, recognizing the glassy glow and shallow breathing. She touched Livia's forehead with the back of her hand and recoiled as if she had touched hot coals. "Gods," she muttered, cynicism fading from her voice to give way to genuine alarm. When Marcia was informed, her reaction was immediate and devoid of any emotion except financial pragmatism. A sick prostitute was a liability.
"Get her out of here," she ordered 2 burly slaves, as matter-of-factly as she would discard spoiled food. "Take it to the deposit of funds. Leave a jug of water. If the gods want her, she will live. If not, it spares the rest of us from contagion." The storehouse was a grave for the living, a dark, windowless room where the air was thick with the smell of mold, rats, and hopelessness. To be thrown there, in a pile of filthy rags, was to be formally abandoned to die. And so began Livia's first battlefront, a solitary war against invasion in her own body. She plunged into a feverish delirium. The damp walls of the warehouse turned into the tall, dark trees of Germania. She heard the sound of the wind on leaves that did not exist and called out to her mother in her native tongue, her voice a scratch on her dry throat. The fever was merciless, burning away memories and fears, reducing it to a primary need: water. But she wasn't completely alone. The second battlefront was fought in darkness by its unlikely allies. Helena, defying Marcia's explicit prohibition, began a clandestine campaign of mercy. Every night she would sneak up to the storeroom. She brought with him fresh water stolen from Marcia's personal reserve and a thin broth made of bones and vegetable scraps that she managed to steal from the kitchen. With infinite patience, she moistened Livia's chapped lips, forcing small amounts of liquid down her throat. "Fight, little mouse. Don't let these bastards win. Fight!" The news of Livia's indisposition reached Caio on his weekly visit. Marcia's evasive answer, "She's resting," activated all his soldier instincts. He knew the brutality of that place. He found Gaia, the prostitute who was jealous of Livia, and pressed her against the wall of an alley. For fear of her praetorian fury and the temptation of some silver denarii, she told the truth. The fury on Caio's face gave way to cold despair. That same night, he committed an act that could have ended his career. He climbed the high back wall of the lupanar, falling silently into the dark courtyard. He found the storeroom and Livia's vision, a shaky and delirious pile of bones, almost broke him. He returned the next night, bringing with him a medicus, a brooding Greek named Theon, who owed him a life-or-death favor from a campaign in Pannonia. Under cover of darkness, with Gaia standing guard, Theon examined Livia in the flickering light of an oil lamp. "It's swamp fever," the doctor said, his voice gravel. "Strong, but it's not the plague. I saw stronger legionnaires being knocked down by it." He had no magic potions, only the practical wisdom of the battlefields. He cleaned Livia's bed wounds, forced a bitter infusion of willow bark between her lips, and gave instructions to Helena and Gaius. Keep her hydrated, keep her warm, but not to the point of suffocation. The rest depends on her strength and the will of the gods. The battle lasted almost 2 weeks. The nights were a succession of clandestine visits from Helena and Gaius, a conspiracy of compassion in the darkness. During the day, Livia struggled alone in her delirium. She faced the face of Silanus, which was transforming into that of the legionary who had captured her. She felt Marcia's cold touch on her feverish skin. But in the midst of the nightmares, she also saw Caio's worried face and felt Helena's firm hand on her shoulder, pulling her back from the edge of the abyss. Then one morning, the turning point. The fever broke. The devastating heat receded, leaving her drenched in sweat and weak as a newborn, but alive. And for the first time in days, lucid. When Marcia finally unlocked the door, hoping to find a body to be discreetly disposed of, she stopped in shock. Livia was sitting, leaning against the wall, thin and frail, but her eyes, clear and focused, contained a glow of polished iron. Livia had won. Against all odds, against illness, abandonment, and despair, she had survived. As she stood up, leaning on a Helena who was crying silently for the first time in years, Livia was not the same woman that had been dragged into that room. The fever had burned away her last illusions and fears. The woman who emerged from that darkness was made of scars and steel. She had fought her great battle, and as she conquered her own life, she realized with terrifying clarity that no man, no matter how powerful, could inspire the same level of dread as the darkness she had just conquered alone.
The woman who emerged from the woodshed was not the same one who had been dragged there. The fever had burned the softness of his face, leaving behind sharper angles and a stillness in his eyes that was more intimidating than any fury. Their survival became a silent legend within the walls of the Lupanar. The other women no longer looked at her with envy or contempt, but with a kind of fearful reverence. She had faced death, the final fate of all of them, and returned. Marcia, in turn, treated her with a calculating caution. Livia was no longer just a valuable asset. It was an unpredictable asset, and that made it dangerous. The time of passive accumulation was over. Livia now understood that the information she had about Silanus was a sword. Keeping it in the scabbard offered no security. It only made it heavy. She needed to unsheath it. The question was how and when. The opportunity came, as always, wrapped in the arrogance of a powerful man. Senator Silanus, on learning of his recovery, was perversely delighted. He saw her not as a woman who had overcome a terrible ordeal, but as a breeding animal of superior quality who had proven her robustness. He summoned her to the upper hall more often. For him, his survival was yet another facet of his exoticism. The night of proclamation began like many others. Solano was celebrating. Emperor Tiberius was isolated in Capri, and power in Rome was in the hands of the feared Praetorian prefect Sejanus. Silanus, a shrewd ally of Sejanus, had just engineered the undoing of a rival, the old and respected Lucius Aruntius, who openly despised the rise of the prefect. Drunk on Chios wine and with his own success, Silanus boasted to Livia, his captive and, in his mind, insignificant audience. "Today, Brenna," he said, using her birth name as a form of intimate possession, "I have shown these old Republicans what true power is." He described in minute detail how he had intercepted a letter from Aruntius to a relative in Greece. The letter was innocuous, but Silanus, with the help of a master forger, inserted a single sentence, a veiled but treacherous criticism of Sejanus. Then he made sure that the doctored letter reached the mayor's hands. "Aruntius is finished," laughed Solano, filling his glass. "He will be accused of treason. Their property will be confiscated. And I will buy your village in Tusculum for a fraction of its value." He leaned in, his breath of mulled wine on Livia's face. "This is how empires are built, my savage, not with swords, but with ink and whispers." That night, back in her cell, Livia did not sleep. The plan formed in his mind, clear and terrible. She had the weapon, the target, and the motive. The unification of her power was complete. Now it was time for the proclamation. She waited 2 days, letting Solano's poison spread. So he put his plan into action. She approached Davus, one of the slaves who had taken her to the woodshed. She had watched him for months. He had a wife in the kitchen and a young daughter whom he idolized. He was desperate and trustworthy. In a silent dawn, she cornered him. She showed him his peculium, which now amounted to nearly 500 sesterces. "This is yours," she whispered, "if you do exactly as I say." Davis's eyes widened. It was enough to buy his daughter's freedom. He agreed. Livia gave him a small wax tablet. On it, with the letters that Gaius had taught her, she had written only 3 things: the letter to Greece, the forger on Via Tecta, ask Silanos about his new village. She did not sign with her name. In the lower corner, she scratched the outline of a snarling wolf, the symbol of her lupanar. Davis, trembling, handed the tablet to a bread seller who was delivering to the house of Lucius Arruntius. For the next 4 days were the longest torture of Livia's life. Every sound was a threat. Every look from Marcia was an accusation. She performed her tasks like an automaton, fear, an ice ball in her stomach. Gaius visited her, but found her so distant and pale that he thought the fever had returned. "What's wrong, Brenna?" he pleaded. "You're a million miles away." "I'm hunting," she replied, her voice a thread. He didn't understand. On the 5th day, he arrived. It wasn't a customer. It was a middle-aged man dressed in a simple dark robe, but whose posture and cold eyes screamed danger. He moved with a quiet efficiency that made all the noise of the lupanars cease. This was a wolf among the sheep. He asked to see Marcia. They locked themselves in the office for an hour that seemed like an eternity. When the door opened, Marcia was the color of wax. The man walked directly to Livia, ignoring all the others. His eyes evaluated her, not as Silanus did, with lust, but as a craftsman evaluates a tool. He said in a low voice so that only she could hear, "My master, Lucius, thanks you for your communication. He considers the information useful." He turned to a petrified Marcia and threw a heavy bag on the table. The sound of gold coins was obscene in that place of copper and silver. "The price of the manumission of this slave, and a generous bonus for your future memory lapses on this subject, and on her. Understood?" She could barely nod, her eyes fixed on the gold. The man then turned to Livia. He handed her a roll of papyrus, tied with the ribbon and sealed. The instrumentum manumission, her freedom. He also gave her a smaller but still heavy bag. "A small show of my master's gratitude. A word of advice. Rome is great. Find a new part of her to call your own." He turned and left, as quietly as he arrived. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, all the women were looking at Livia. She was standing in the middle of the Duri courtyard, holding the proof of her freedom in one hand and more gold than she had ever imagined in the other. Helena was crying openly, a sound no one had ever heard. Livia looked at Marcia. In Lena's eyes, she saw a mixture of terror and a new, terrible respect. At that moment, the power dynamics that had governed her life were destroyed and remade. She was no longer a property. She had used the power of one great man to destroy another, and in the process, she had freed herself. This was the act that proclaimed her empire, a one-person empire, born of desperation, forged in intelligence, and conquered with breathtaking audacity. She was free, and the terrifying and glorious vastness of this truth struck her with the force of a wave.
Freedom, Livia discovered, had an unexpected weight. It was heavier than the chains he had used. The chains were simple, their function clear. Freedom was an abyss of endless choices and overwhelming responsibilities. The centralization of her power, the conquest of herself, exacted a terrible price, paid in human currency, leaving a trail of burnt bridges and broken hearts. With a fraction of Aruncio's gold, she rented a small apartment on the Aventine, one of Rome's 7 hills. It was a neighborhood of commoners and merchants, but from her window she could see the green of the Palatine Hill and feel a breeze that did not carry the miasma of Subura. For the first time in years, she had a solid wood door with an iron lock that she controlled herself. The silence in his room was so vast that it buzzed in his ears, accustomed to the constant noise of the lupanar. The first cost was the loss of his tribe. As dysfunctional and brutal as it was, the lupanar offered a form of community. There was an unspoken language of shared suffering, a mutual understanding that needed no words. Now she was completely alone. A few weeks later, driven by a mixture of guilt and longing, she bought a soft, warm wool shawl and returned to Subura. The visit was a disaster of estrangement. Marcia, on seeing her, almost bowed in a show of fearful deference that was more alienating than her former cruelty. The other women turned away from her, looking at her as if she were a ghost or a goddess. Their freedom was a mirror that reflected their imprisonment, and that was unbearable. She found Helena in the courtyard. The Greek accepted the shawl, her fingers tracing the fine wool. But there was a new distance in his eyes, a chasm that friendship could no longer cross. "You don't belong here anymore, little mouse," said Helena, her voice softer than usual. "Your story here is over. If you keep coming back, it will only bring pain to you and to us. Go, live for all of us who cannot." The words were a blessing and an expulsion. When she left the lupanar for the last time, Livia felt the door of her old life close forever. The most devastating cost, however, was Caio. He found her in her new apartment, her face brimming with joy so pure it broke her heart. He spun her in the air, laughing, exultant. In his mind, their love story had come to its happy ending. The obstacle of slavery had been removed. Now he could honorably make her his wife, take her to his farm in Umbria for a life of earthy smell and children with his eyes. But he was celebrating with a ghost. The woman he loved, the vulnerable Brenna he protected, had been a specter created by need and genuine affection. The woman who stood before him now, Livia, the free woman, was hardened and shaped by acts that the simple and honorable soul of Gaius could not comprehend. The conversation took place as the sun set, painting the sky of Rome with bruised colors. "I can't marry you, Caio," she said, every word a stone in her throat. "Why not? You're free. I love you," he said, his confusion turning to pain. "You love someone I pretended to be," she replied, forcing herself to be cruel to be kind. "To achieve this freedom, Caio, I did not pray to the gods. I made a pact with demons. I used one man's secrets to fuel another's revenge. I played with the lives of senators as if they were pieces in a game. The woman who does this cannot be the wife of a good man. It would poison your honor, your home, your children. But you did it to survive, to be free," he argued, grabbing her hands. "Yes," she said, pulling her hands back. "But some things once done cannot be undone. They change you. They mark your soul. Look at me, Caio. Take a real look. Don't you see the shadows in my eyes? I will never lose them. I would take the darkness of Subura to her light in Umbria, and she would blot it all out." Understanding finally reached him, and the pain on his face was the deepest wound Livia had ever inflicted. He was the only pure goodness she had known in Rome, a beacon of hope, and now his own hand was turning off that light. He had saved her from death, and she was saving him from herself. He departed at dawn, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any scream. The centralization of her empire in itself had crowned her, but it had also exiled her to an island of her own making. She was the monarch, the legislator, and the only citizen. And the cost of her throne was absolute loneliness, the realization that in order to build her fortress, she had to demolish all the bridges that connected her to the rest of humanity.
Freedom was an empty room. In the lupanar, the noise and constant presence of other people were a distraction from the terror within. In the solitude of her apartment on the Aventine, Livia's ghosts had all the space in the world to dance. Memories were no longer fragments, they were unwanted roommates. The face of his first client, Marcia's cruel laugh, Solano's cold and possessive touch, the look of pain on Caio's face. Every night, they visited her in their dreams. During the day, they hid in the shadows of his room.
She realized that manumission had freed her body, but her mind remained a prisoner, chained to a dungeon of trauma. She understood that she needed a purge, an exorcism, a deliberate act to burn the past and reclaim the territory of his own mind. It wouldn't be easy. The strategies that kept her alive, distrust, hypervigilance, the ability to dissociate, were now the walls of her new prison. To truly free herself, she needed to dismantle the very defenses that had saved her. The process began with the physical. She gathered the last vestiges of her previous life. The blue linen tunic she had worn for Salinas, the worn shoes she had trodden on the floor of the Lupanar thousands of times, a small bone comb that Helen had given her. She took these objects to the brazier in her small courtyard. As she threw them into the fire, she felt no relief, but a wave of panic. They were the relics of her survival. Destroying them was like destroying the proof that she had won. But she forced herself to watch as the fire consumed them, turning the flax into black ashes and the bone into coal. The legacy of a woman like Livia would not be engraved on triumphal arches or declaimed in the Senate. It would be a living thing, woven into the daily fabric of the city, as persistent and discreet as the ivy that clings to the walls of the great monuments. His legacy would be built not with marble, but with bread, wine, and a rare form of justice. After his purge, Livia used what was left of Aruncio's gold and her wits, now sharp as a knife, to reinvent herself. She did not aspire to become a respectable matron wrapped in wool and virtue. This was a fantasy for other lives. Instead, she immersed herself in the world she knew, the world of business, commerce, and secrets. But this time, the rules would be hers. She bought a modestly sized but well-located Calpona tavern near the Boarius Forum, Rome's bustling cattle market. It was a hub of activity, frequented by olive oil merchants from Hispania, Greek sailors, and legionnaires on leave who sought to forget the brutality of the borders. They were men of business, not of lineage, men who cared more about the quality of the wine than the past of the woman who served it. The tavern of the German she-wolf, as it became informally known, became his kingdom. The skills she had acquired in the lupanar, once tools of survival, were transformed into instruments of power.
Her ability to read a man in the blink of an eye, to see the greed behind a smile or the fear behind the bravado, made her a formidable businesswoman. Its memory, trained to retain the whispered secrets of senators, has made it a hub of information. Merchants came to her not only for the food, but to feel the pulse of the city. What do you say about the new taxes on Egypt's corn, Livia? Is that fabric supplier from Puteoli reliable? She never sold information directly, as she had done before. Instead, she used them to build a network of loyalty and protection. A warning here, a recommendation there. In return, her tavern was protected. Her supplies were never stolen, and the local magistrates never seemed to find reasons to inspect it. But her true legacy was not built on sesterces or information. It was built with human lives. She became a haven for other women whom life had mistreated. Her first maid was a freed woman named Nila, a young woman who had fled from a patron who saw her as his property, even after manumission. Nila arrived at her door scared and hungry. Livia gave him a roof, a job, and most importantly, security. When Nila's former patron appeared, demanding her return, Livia faced him at the door. She did not shout or threaten. She just looked at him with her cold eyes and said, "This woman is under my protection. If you see her again, or if any of your friends see it, I'll have a conversation with a friend of mine in the warehouses of Arunzio. I'm sure he would be very interested to know how his scales are a little lighter than they should be." The man turned pale and never returned. Word spread. Livia's tavern became a place where a woman could find work without having to endure daring hands or humiliating proposals. It paid fair wages and demanded hard work, but offered in return a dignity that was rarer than gold. She taught her women to read the bills, to count the money, to recognize a fraud. Never depend on a man for your financial security, she told them. A man can die, leave, or betray. The numbers don't. Years turned into a decade. Livia became a figurehead in her corner of Rome, a middle-aged woman whose blonde hair was now speckled with silver, like the first frost of winter. But lines on his face told a story that no historian would bother to write. One day, a man entered his tavern. He was older, his skin tanned by the sun, and his posture still that of a soldier, even under the clothes of a wealthy farmer. It took a moment for Livia to recognize him. It was Caio. He was in Rome to sell his harvest of olives. They sat down at a table in the corner, the noise and life of the tavern swirling around them like a river. There was an awkwardness between them, but there was no bitterness. It was the soft melancholy of a story that belonged to other people, younger and different. He spoke of his wife, a good and simple woman, and his 2 children. She spoke of her tavern and her woman. "You've built a kingdom, Livia," he said, looking around with genuine admiration. "It's just a tavern, Caio," she replied with a smile. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I have seen kingdoms built with swords that are not as strong as this. You give people a place to belong." When he was gone, Livia stared at the door for a long time. Her legacy, she realized, was not the stone and wood of the building. It was the woman who now knew how to read. It was Nila, who now managed her own business in the market. It was the living proof, breathing and working around her, that it was possible to be dragged into the abyss and out the other side, not just to survive, but to build. Her legacy was the stubborn and unshakable truth that even in the darkest shadow of the empire, a single soul with enough courage and cunning could turn on a light and call the place his own.
The Julio-Claudian dynasty, like a sick organism, continued its march of glory and self-destruction. Tiberius gave way to Caligula, Caligula to Claudius, Claudius to Nero. The great empire of Rome, engrossed in its own fevers of conquest and conspiracy, barely noticed the transition of power that took place in a bustling tavern near the Tiber. Livia, now a woman whose years sat comfortably on her shoulders, was abdicating her throne. His body was beginning to feel the weight of decades of hard work. The mornings were stricter, the nights longer. His heiress was not a daughter of his blood, but of his spirit. Amara, a young Numidian whom Livia had taken in years before, an orphan with eyes as intelligent and perceptive as Livia's own. Amara had learned it all: how to negotiate with suppliers, how to calm a fight, how to read a day's balance sheet in the faces of her customers, and how to manage finances with an iron fist. Livia's dynasty, that of the lone survivor, was coming to an end. But in its place, she had founded an empire, not of territory, but of principles, a system, a refuge, a business built on the foundation of resilience, which could and should continue without it. The handover of power was a typically practical event, devoid of ceremony. On a quiet afternoon, Livia handed Amara the heavy leather bead book and the bronze keys of the cellar. "The rules are simple," Livia said, her voice now permanently hoarse. "Pay fairly, protect ours, and never, ever let a man think he knows more about his own money than you do." Amara, now a confident woman, took the keys. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "What are you going to do now, Livia?" "Rest," replied Livia. The word sounded strange and luxurious in his mouth. She sold the tavern to Amara for a sum that was more of a gift than a price, keeping just enough to ensure a worry-free old age. With the money, she bought a small house with a piece of land on the side of Janiculum Hill, a place where the roar of Rome became a distant hum and the smell of rosemary and pine hung in the air. Their days, once dictated by fear or the demands of commerce, came to be governed by the sun and the seasons. She learned the rhythms of the land, tending a small vineyard and some olive trees. She spent hours sitting on a stone bench under a fig tree, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, a simple pleasure that had once seemed more unattainable to her than freedom. But she was not alone. Her house has become a pilgrimage destination. His women, now mothers and business owners, came to visit, bringing fresh bread, cheese, the latest gossip in town, and most importantly, his children. The children ran and played in her garden, their laughter the sweetest sound Livia had ever known. She had become the silent matriarch of a tribe she had forged from the broken pieces of women's lives. One summer evening, sitting on her porch, looking at the carpet of lights that was Rome below, Livia reflected on her extraordinary journey. From the verdant darkness of Germania to the stone darkness of Lupanar. From the embrace of an honorable soldier to the threat of a corrupt senator. From the solitude of freedom to the community of her tavern. The official history of Rome would be told through the men whose names she had once feared and manipulated. But the real story, the bloodline of the city, pulsated in the millions of lives like his, untold stories of struggle and perseverance. The Empire of Rome, with its legions and aqueducts, was a magnificent structure, but ultimately impersonal and fragile. His own empire, built on the foundation of dignity and shared strength, was small but indestructible. It was alive in the legacy that she had passed on to Amara, and that Amara, in turn, would pass on to another. She closed her eyes, feeling the night breeze on her face. There was no longer any fear. There was no longer any fighting. She was Brenna, the girl of the forest, and she was Livia, the she-wolf of Rome. She was the slave and the queen. And finally, on her little piece of land, under the vast, silent sky, she was at peace. She was at home.